He gifted his wife's mother a luxury car. I got a piggy bank. That's how my Christmas began, with a red BMW glistening in their driveway and $3 lonely rattling inside a plastic toy meant for toddlers. I smiled, stayed quiet, and drove home alone. But silence is never the end of a mother's story. The next morning, I left them something on their doorstep, something they would never forget. There are moments in life when a sound becomes a memory before it even finishes echoing. That Christmas morning, it was the sharp little clink of 3 wrinkled dollar bills dropping inside a piggy bank shaped like a pink cartoon cow. That sound didn't just sting. It rearranged something inside me, gently, quietly, like a picture frame turning itself toward the wall. The living room smelled of cinnamon-scented candles, and the kind of sugar cookies people make only for photos. Or rather, the kind other families make for photos. I had baked mine from scratch, left them on a floral tray the way I always did, telling myself tradition mattered even if participation did not. My son and his wife barely glanced at them, too distracted by their curated mountain of perfectly wrapped gifts stacked near the reclaimed wood coffee table. They never let me set a cup on without a coaster. I stood beside the tree, clutching my small present for my daughter-in-law, a knitted scarf I had worked on each night after my shift at the clinic. Lavender. Her favorite color, or so I had been told. My fingers had stiffened during the colder months, but I kept stitching, believing gifts made by hand held a kind of truth store-bought things never could. The truth, it seemed, was not invited to that house. My son, Michael, was buzzing around the living room like a man auditioning for a commercial about having his life together. His smile had the shine of ambition, the polish of someone who thought success was measured in gloss. His hair was trimmed the way corporate ladders like their young men trimmed, clean, precise, forgettable. But I saw the little boy in him, the one who once saved ticket stubs from every fair ride and stuck them on the fridge like trophies. The one who used to beg me to stay in his room until he fell asleep, asking me to tell him one more story even when his eyes could barely stay open. That boy was nowhere near this room. But mothers carry old versions of their children the way trees carry seasons in their rings. Quietly, unspoken, yet always present. His wife, Samantha, floated beside him with the grace of someone who'd been taught her whole life that her presence alone was decoration. She didn't look at me directly unless she needed something, and even then her voice had a strange softness, like a pillow that's been beaten too many times and no longer remembers its shape. She liked to talk about minimalism, but every corner of the house was crowded with new purchases. Furniture that looked fragile, plants that belonged to climates they'd never visited, frames holding quotes about gratitude. Gratitude, I learned, was something they displayed on walls but never offered in person. Still I came. Because Christmas was supposed to be sacred. Because tradition was a doorway you keep open, even when you're the only one walking through it. And so I stood there, hands folded, watching my son pull Samantha's mother to the front door with the kind of excitement he used to reserve for me. "You're going to love this," he said, practically glowing. "You deserve it more than anyone." That last line sank into my chest with a quiet thud. The cold morning air rushed in when he opened the door. Outside, nestled in the driveway, was a pristine white BMW with a red bow large enough to be seen from space. The morning sun caught its metallic sheen, making it look like something pulled from a wealthy child's imagination. Samantha's mother gasped dramatically, one hand on her chest, the other clutching her designer purse, as if the moment needed props. "Oh, Michael," she sighed, leaning into him like gratitude was a performance art. "You are too much." I stood behind them, smiling politely, applauding softly, my breath fogging the air while my heart tried to stay steady. I had not seen my son this animated in years. Not at my birthday, not at my retirement dinner, not even when I helped him furnish his first apartment with mismatched thrift store finds that we pretended were eclectic. They gathered around the gleaming car, taking photos, laughing, celebrating. At some point, someone asked me to take a picture of them. I did. My hands were steady, perfectly steady, steadier than my emotions deserved. When they finally returned inside, my son turned to me. "We didn't forget you, Mom," he said with a sheepish grin. As if the sentence were a joke only he understood, he reached under the tree and handed me a gift the size of a soup can. Wrapped quickly, corners uneven. I unwrapped it slowly, pretending suspense. Inside was a bright pink piggy bank meant for little girls who still collected stickers and pressed flowers into their diaries. Its plastic surface reflected the light in a way that felt almost mocking. I shook it lightly. $3 rattled inside. 3. One for each decade I had worked shifts that tore my knees apart. One for every time I held him through heartbreaks he swore would end him. One for each year of my widowhood, when he promised he would always take care of me. $3 for a lifetime of being his mother. I heard Samantha giggle softly. It's supposed to be symbolic, she said. Like starting fresh. Saving for something nice. I felt something inside my throat tighten, but I smiled, the warm practice kind of smile mothers learn to wear even when no one has earned it. It's lovely, I said. And for a moment I wondered if they believed me, or if the lie was so gentle it passed as truth. The rest of Christmas was a blur of conversations that excluded me, jokes I didn't understand, plans for vacations I wasn't invited to. I left early, kissing my son's cheek on the way out. He barely turned his head. Driving home, the piggy bank sat beside me on the passenger seat, illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard. It looked almost childlike in the silence of my car, its painted smile frozen, its ears perked up like it was waiting for a story. When I pulled into my driveway, the weight of the day settled on me like snow that refuses to melt. I held the piggy bank in my hands and whispered, "This is what you think I'm worth?" The answer, of course, was already inside. I set it down gently on my kitchen table, next to the cooling cookies that no one had eaten. And then I sat in the dim light of my small home, the home that had held every version of my son, and I let the truth rise inside me, slow but unstoppable. Silence is a skill. But revenge is a language mothers rarely speak, yet never forget how to write. By the time dawn arrived, pale and quiet, I knew exactly what I would do, and by the time the sun lifted itself over the neighborhood roofs, I was already on their doorstep, leaving a gift wrapped in plain brown paper. One that would make Samantha scream loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. One that would teach my son a lesson he had forgotten. A mother's love is patient. A mother's dignity is not. And a mother's silence is never the end of the story. On the doorstep, the package looked harmless. Plain brown paper, corners folded with the same care a nurse uses when tucking in a patient. No glittering bow, no embossed tag. Just my son's name in my handwriting, the one that had once appeared on permission slips, field trip forms, and the notes I used to tuck into his lunchbox. The neighborhood still slept when I set it down. The cold air pinched my cheeks and turned my breath into small ghost clouds. Behind their curtains, the expensive house pretended to be peaceful. Inside somewhere, the keys to the white luxury car probably rested in a crystal bowl, still warm from yesterday's applause. I stood there a moment longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. There is a particular stillness that comes just before consequences arrive. It is the hush before a doctor returns with test results, the pause between a judge's intake of breath and the first word of a sentence. That morning, I felt that stillness settle over their porch. Not cruel, not vengeful, just inevitable. The package was not heavy. The weight of it came from somewhere else. I turned and walked back to my car, my steps soft on the frosted path. As I drove away, their house shrank in the rearview mirror, but the memories tied to it did not. They sat beside me, uninvited passengers, reminding me how long it had taken to arrive at this quiet rebellion. To understand that little rectangle of brown paper, you would have to travel backward with me. Back past the BMW with its red bow. Past the piggy bank with its 3 lonely bills. Back to a much smaller house and a much younger boy, who once thought a handmade coupon for free hugs was the greatest gift a mother could receive. Michael had been born in a storm. The night my body decided it could no longer keep him safely tucked away, rain lashed the hospital windows and the power flickered twice. Nurses walked with flashlights in their pockets, and every time thunder rolled overhead, the lights flickered just enough to remind us that control is always a fragile illusion. He came into the world red and furious, shouting his existence at strangers who laughed and called him strong. When the nurse placed him on my chest and his crying slowed into hiccups, I whispered the first promise I ever made him. I told him that no matter how loud the world became, I would always be his quiet, his shelter. We lived in a rented duplex back then, the kind with thin walls and neighbors who argued about television volume more than they argued about rent. I worked nights at the small hospital clinic and cleaned offices on weekends. His father, before the heart attack took him, drove a delivery truck and came home smelling of cardboard and exhaustion. We did not have luxury cars. We had a second-hand sedan held together by hope, duct tape, and regular oil changes. For Michael, though the world was vast and full of possibilities, he grew up on library cards and yard sale toys. On second-hand bikes I learned to repair with oil-stained fingers. On the kind of birthdays where the cake was homemade and the candles did not match but the singing was loud enough to make up for it. One year, when money was tighter than usual, I wrapped his gifts in newspaper comics instead of store-bought paper. He said it was his favorite wrapping ever, because he could read the jokes before opening the present. Children measure love in presents, not presents. At least they do at first. He made things for me back then. A hand-painted clay dish for my earrings. A Mother's Day card covered in crooked hearts. A coupon booklet he printed at school with our old inkjet, promising to wash the dishes, to take out the trash without reminding, to give me 10 back rubs whenever I wanted. I kept them all, even long after the coupons expired and used. It comforted me to know that once, in his mind, my tired shoulders and unwashed dishes had been worthy of such devotion. Then life moved forward as it insists on doing. He grew taller. His world expanded from our street to the entire town, and then beyond to the city where internships lived and the university where ambition was the local language. He discovered finance articles and podcasts that talked about leverage and assets and maximizing returns. He learned to say phrases like wealth management and long-term strategy. I encouraged him proudly, even when his new vocabulary left me behind. I had raised him to reach, after all. But somewhere between his first internship and his first promotion, something subtle shifted. Small changes at first. A tightness in his voice when I mentioned money. A visible discomfort when I insisted on paying for my own dinner. As if my independence embarrassed him. A tendency to introduce me simply as his mom without explaining where he came from, what we had survived together. The first Christmas after his big promotion, he insisted on hosting. He lived in a sleek apartment then, all glass and chrome, with a view of the river that made his old bedroom window seem like a joke. I arrived with my humble casserole, my best dress pressed carefully the night before. He greeted me with a hug that smelled of expensive cologne and scented candles. His gifts that year were big and glossy. Electronics for his friends. Designer perfume for his girlfriend. For me, a digital photo frame preloaded with pictures of him at business events, accepting plaques from people in suits, standing beside company banners. There was one photo of us together, taken at my retirement party, cropped so that my worn cardigan looked almost intentional. He said he thought I would like to see his achievements on the mantle. I smiled and said I did. But that night, alone in my small house, I found myself scrolling through the photos and counting how many featured me. 1 out of 30. I told myself it did not matter. A mother's love, I reminded myself, should be unconditional. So I applauded his success, even when pieces of it seemed built on forgetting where he came from. Then he met Samantha. She arrived in his life like a carefully scripted scene. Immaculate nails, curated wardrobe, an Instagram feed that looked more like a magazine spread than a record of a human existence. She came from a world where vacations were annual and brand names rolled off the tongue without guilt. Her parents had a beach house, a ski condo, and a family financial advisor who sent them quarterly reports tied with ribbon. When Michael first introduced us, she shook my hand firmly, but her eyes slid quickly past the peeling paint on my front door, the thrift store couch, the faded family photos on the wall. She told me she loved how cozy my home was, the way people comment on a hand-knit sweater they would never be caught wearing in public. Her mother, Diane, did not come to meet me for months. When she finally did, it was on neutral ground, a brunch place with reclaimed wood tables and waiters who spoke about coffee the way sommeliers speak about wine. Diane wore a scarf that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bills and looked around like she was silently grading the cleanliness of the cutlery. She spoke easily about foundations, investments, tax strategies. I listened quietly, stirring my coffee, trying to ignore the subtle lines that formed around her mouth whenever Michael mentioned my old job at the clinic or the neighborhood where he grew up. It was obvious she saw me as a chapter he should have closed long ago, not as the person who had held the pen when his story began. People like Diane often believe they know how the world should be arranged. They see generosity as something that flows downward from their position at the top, never sideways, never up. As the relationship deepened, so did my sense of distance. Wedding plans came. I wasn't excluded exactly, but my presence was allocated like budget funds. A small speech here. A seat at this table, not that one. My dress choices gently redirected away from anything Diane felt might clash with her carefully chosen palette. She assumed the role of director effortlessly. I was given a supporting part. At the reception, while Michael and Samantha danced under strings of fairy lights with their friends, I caught a fragment of Diane's voice telling someone that her daughter had finally married someone on her level. The words were not meant for me. They arrived anyway, lodging themselves in a place I had not known was still vulnerable. The years after that blurred together in a rhythm of occasional visits and polite calls. They moved into the large house in the nicer neighborhood. I downsized into the small home I could afford comfortably on my pension. Whenever I came over, Samantha would offer me herbal tea and almond milk cookies that tasted like discipline, not comfort. She talked about their next renovation, their next trip, their next investment. Michael talked mostly about work. I talked about what I knew how to talk about. The neighbor's new baby. The nurse I had mentored who had just finished her degree. The way the magnolia tree on my street bloomed every spring without asking for anything in return. Sometimes when I mentioned missing his father, Michael would look away, as if grief were an old television show he had outgrown. Then came the Christmas of the BMW. He called a week before, voice bright, telling me he had big plans this year. He insisted I come over early on Christmas morning. Said he wanted me to be part of something special. I ironed my best blouse for that invitation. I spent hours making cookies, the recipe his father had loved. I wrapped Samantha's scarf in white tissue and tied it with a simple red ribbon. I told myself the distance I had been feeling would close just for a day. Christmas had a way of reminding people what mattered, I thought. When I arrived, the house was already buzzing. Samantha's siblings and cousins had flown in. Diane stood in the kitchen commanding the space with the confidence of someone who has never had to share. Michael was all nerves and excitement, constantly glancing at the clock, at his phone, at the window. I did not know about the car yet. Not until he dragged Diane out to the driveway. Not until I saw the white gleam of it and the ridiculous bow catching the weak winter sunlight. I watched him beam while he handed her the keys. I watched her pretend to protest, then accept, then cry artfully. The way women in commercials cry without smudging their makeup. I watched Samantha film the entire scene on her phone, probably already mentally editing the caption. The moment felt like a scene from a show where I had been cast as an extra in the background. Back inside, when he pressed the piggy bank into my hands, some part of me detached just enough to observe the situation almost clinically. He was not trying to be cruel, that much I could see. He looked rushed and distracted, as if he had thrown the gift together last minute and believed the gesture was sufficient. Samantha watched me with a slightly amused expression, as if wondering whether I would be grateful or offended, perhaps betting on the former. The 3 bills inside were folded carelessly. The bank itself was clearly from some novelty shop. There was no note, no explanation. Even the symbolism they later tried to attach to it was thin. Starting fresh. Saving up for something nice. A silly, lazy metaphor for a woman who had spent 40 years living on budgets so tight they squeaked. I smiled anyway, because that is what I had always done. But on the drive home, something inside me refused to slide this incident into the same dusty drawer where I had been storing all my other small hurts. Not this time. Not this Christmas. The radio hummed softly in the background as I drove, but I barely heard it. My mind replayed the day in loops. The look on Diane's face when she saw the car. The ease with which my son had declared she deserved it more than anyone. The careless weight of the piggy bank in my hands. By the time I turned onto my street, my eyes were dry but my chest felt heavy, as if grief and anger had braided themselves into something new. In my kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator greeted me. The house smelled faintly of pine and sugar, comforting and sad at once. I set the piggy bank on the table and sat down opposite it, like we were about to have a difficult conversation. I thought about everything I had given him. Not just money, which had always been scarce, but time, energy, pieces of my own youth. I thought of the nights I had gone without new shoes so he could have the brand name sneakers everyone else wore. The double shifts I had worked so his field trips would be paid in full, so he would not have to pretend he was sick on the day his class went to the museum. I remembered the time I had quietly sold the small gold bracelet my mother left me, so I could help him cover his deposit on that first city apartment. He had thanked me, hugged me hard, promised he would pay me back. I had told him not to worry about it. Parents do what they must, I had said. Now, years later, I watched him give a luxury car to a woman who had never once sat in a dark waiting room wondering if the lights would stay on. It was not about the car. Not really. It was about recognition. About who he chose to honor and who he chose to overlook. The piggy bank sat between us, its painted eyes wide and blank. I picked it up and shook it again, listening to the 3 bills rustle inside. I imagined dropping them into one of the hospital donation boxes I used to pass every day. $3 could buy a patient a little comfort item. A magazine, a coffee, could mean something there. Here it just felt like an insult disguised as cuteness. In that moment I realized something important. I had allowed my son to believe that my love came with no boundaries. That I would tolerate neglect and thoughtlessness because I understood the pressures he was under, the world he was navigating. I had told myself it was noble, that patience was proof of love. But patience without respect turns into self-erasure. Some lines should never be crossed. When they are, and no one notices, they become patterns. Patterns become normal. And what we accept quietly teaches people how to treat us. I slept badly that night when I managed to sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the red bow, the shiny hood of the car. The way Michael's eyes had lit up when Diane pretended to protest the extravagance. I saw my own hands holding the plastic pig, the way my fingers trembled just slightly before I forced them to be still. Around 2 in the morning I got up and made tea, even though my doctor had told me to cut back on caffeine. The house creaked in its usual places, familiar and unthreatening. On the table, the piggy bank gleamed faintly in the light from the street lamp. I sat down and pulled an old shoebox from the cupboard. Inside were fragments of a life I had mostly kept to myself. Old letters from Michael's father stained with time. Polaroids from the early years, edges curled, colors fading but faces unmistakable. A flyer from the community fundraiser where I had spent an entire weekend baking pies to help pay for new playground equipment at Michael's old school. A copy of the title to his first car, the used sedan I had co-signed for when he was 19, my credit the only reason the bank had said yes. There were also documents. Pages I rarely thought about but never discarded. Copies of life insurance policies, bank statements from the modest savings I had scraped together over the years, the deed to my little house. Looking at it all spread out on the table, I realized I had more power than I felt. Michael had grown into a man who measured worth in numbers. Fine. If that was the language he understood, I would speak it fluently just once. I pulled a blank notebook toward me and began to write. Not a letter filled with accusations. I knew that would only make him defensive. Instead, I started listing facts. The amount of money I had helped him with over the years. The practical sacrifices I had made. The things I had quietly passed down to him, not as debts but as gifts. I wrote them not to shame him, but to remind myself that I had not been a small presence in his life. I had been foundational. Then I wrote something else. A list of what I needed if I was going to stay in relationship with him. Respect. Inclusion, not as an obligation but as a genuine desire to share his life. An acknowledgement in word and in deed that the woman who had raised him was not a relic to be kept in the attic of his memory, but a living human being whose dignity mattered. By the time the sky outside began to pale, the tea had gone cold and my hand ached. But my mind felt strangely clear. Revenge, I realized, did not have to be cruel to be effective. It did not have to involve shouting or dramatic confrontations. It could be as simple as refusing to play a role in a story where you are constantly disrespected. But I also wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done, to understand in a way he could not shrug off, that he had crossed a line. That was when the idea of the gift came. Not something destructive. Not anything that would harm his shiny life or his spotless reputation. I had no interest in damaging his career or slashing his car tires. Those were the reactions of someone who wanted chaos. I wanted clarity. I thought of all the times he had told me, half joking, that I would never have to worry in my old age. That he would make sure I was comfortable, that all my sacrifices were not in vain. I thought of the trust one had placed in those words. Then I thought of the $3 in the piggy bank. If he valued me at that amount in practice, perhaps it was time to show him what his life would look like if I took him seriously. I opened a folder from the shoebox. Inside was a draft document I had made a few years earlier when I first spoke with a lawyer about my will. At the time I had planned to leave everything to him. My house, the modest savings account, the small life insurance policy from the union. It was not much by the standards of his new world, but it was everything I had. The lawyer had suggested adding a letter of intent as well, explaining my wishes in personal terms. I had never gotten around to writing that part. Now, pen in hand, I began. I wrote about wanting my small assets to go where they were truly appreciated. I wrote about the neighbor girl across the street who had just been accepted to nursing school, but was struggling with tuition. About the community clinic that had taken me in years ago when I needed flexible hours, the same clinic now fighting to stay open. About my friend Rosa, who had no family nearby and whose only security was her social pension and the little apartment she had managed to rent. As the words flowed, the gift shaped itself. I would change my will. I would redirect what little wealth I had to people and places that understood its value, not in terms of status but in terms of survival and gratitude. And then I would tell him, not in a screaming match, not in a tear-stained phone call, but in a way that would be impossible for him to ignore, delivered to his doorstep while the memory of the BMW and the piggy bank was still fresh. The brown paper package began in that notebook, in that pre-dawn quiet. Inside it, by the time I finished preparing it, there would be several things. A copy of the new will, notarized, with his name conspicuously absent from the list of beneficiaries. A letter from the lawyer confirming that I had removed him as the primary heir, with the explanation that this decision was based on my wish that my legacy support those who genuinely valued my life and presence. And finally, a handwritten letter from me. Not begging, not accusing, simply explaining that while I loved him as only a mother can, I could no longer tolerate being treated as a background character in his story. That relationships like finances required investment. That my heart was not a savings account he could ignore until he needed it. I spent the next day in motion. I called the lawyer first thing when the office opened after the holiday. They sounded surprised to hear from me so soon, but not judgmental. Money, they knew, often followed emotional weather. By noon the documents were in order. We met in person, and I signed papers with the same careful hand I had once used to sign permission slips. The lawyer asked if I was sure. I said yes. They told me I could always change it later if things improved. I nodded without committing either way. On the way home, I stopped by the clinic and made a quiet promise to the director about future support. I visited my neighbor's daughter and listened to her talk excitedly about rotations and exams, watching the way her eyes shone with the same hunger to help that had once lived in mine. I thought, with a small smile, that my legacy would be better served in hands like hers. Back in my kitchen, I gathered everything and laid it out on the table. The legal papers, the letters, a photocopy of the piggy bank receipt I had found crumpled in the bag, showing just how little thought had gone into that gift. I held it all for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Then I folded it neatly, slid it into a plain cardboard envelope, and wrapped it in brown paper from the roll I kept under the sink for thrift store finds and homemade cookies. On the front I wrote his name one letter at a time. No dear. No love from. Just Michael in my steady hand. The act itself felt almost ceremonial. By the time dawn approached again that second morning I was ready. I dressed warmly, pulled on my coat, and tucked the package under my arm. The streets were still empty when I drove, frost glinting on lawns like scattered glass. At their house, the BMW sat proudly in the driveway, bow slightly askew, as if drunk on attention. I walked up the path slowly, remembering the first time I had carried him, as a toddler, up the steps of our old duplex, terrified he would slip through my arms. Now I carried the consequences of his choices instead. On the porch, I set the package down carefully, aligning it with the welcome mat that had some polish saying about blessings on it. I imagined Diane opening the door, seeing it, assuming it was another expensive gift from some admiring colleague or friend. It might be the first time she realized not all gifts arrive to flatter. I did not ring the bell. This was not about spectacle. It was about truth. So I stepped back, took one last look at the house that now seemed more like a stage than a home, and walked away. As I drove back to my little house, the sky began to brighten. Birds stirred in bare trees, testing their voices against the cold. In my chest something loosened. I had always believed a mother's job was to protect her child from pain. That was true when they were small, when danger came in the form of hot stoves and sharp corners and bullies on the playground. But grown children sometimes needed a different kind of protection. Protection from their own worst impulses. From the comfort of forgetting who they had once been. By the time their household woke up and someone opened the door, my package was already there, waiting like a mirror. Inside, on carefully folded pages, was my quiet revenge. Not an attack. Not a curse. Just a recalibration of value. A reminder that while they were busy measuring worth in horsepower and brand names, the woman they underestimated had remembered how to measure herself. And although I did not see it with my own eyes, I could almost imagine the moment the paper ripped, the pages slid out, and my son's world tilted just a little. The BMW would still be in the driveway. The piggy bank would still be somewhere on his cluttered side table, forgotten, collecting dust instead of coins. But from that moment on, nothing between us would be able to return to what it had been. A car can be returned. Money can be re-earned. A mother reclaiming her dignity is a different kind of transaction. It is irreversible. And later, when his wife's scream tore through that beautiful house and rippled down their spotless hallway, it would not be the scream of someone hurt by violence or scandal. It would be the sound of a woman realizing that the person she had dismissed as a harmless old woman had just rewritten the story of who held power in their family. Not with a BMW. Not with $3 in a toy bank. But with a pen, a will, and a lifetime of love finally drawing a line. In another part of the city, while I rinsed my teacup and watched steam curl from the sink like a tired spirit, the package I'd left on their doorstep began living its second life. The house woke slowly. Dishwasher humming, pipes knocking awake, the quiet choreography of money starting its day. Samantha patted down the hallway in expensive slippers, phone already in hand, thumbs checking notifications before her eyes were fully open. Michael lay in bed staring at the ceiling, pretending he wasn't worried about the market opening after the long holiday weekend. Diane, in the guest room, slept the deep sleep of someone who believes the world will continue turning in her favor. Samantha was the first to see it. She opened the front door to collect the delivery she'd ordered late the night before. A new set of champagne flutes she didn't need but had convinced herself their bar cart did. Instead, she found the plain brown package sitting squarely on the welcome mat, quiet and unassuming beneath the tasteful wreath. She frowned. It did not look like a brand she recognized. No logo, no return address label, no sleek typography promising luxury. Just Michael's name in handwriting that tugged on some distant memory, like a smell she almost recognized but couldn't place. She picked it up, turned it over, checked the corners as if expecting a trick. It didn't rattle. It didn't shift. It just rested in her hands with a patient weight. "Michael," she called over her shoulder. "Did you order something weird?" From the bedroom, his voice drifted back, tired. "What is it?" "I don't know. Just a box. For you. No branding." He appeared in the hallway a moment later, hair tousled, wearing the expensive robe she'd given him last anniversary. When he saw the handwriting, something in his expression changed almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened just a fraction. He recognized the script long before his mind admitted it. "Mom," he said under his breath. Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment she said nothing. Her thoughts moved quickly, like clouds before a storm. She had watched him come home from our house yesterday more subdued than she liked him, quieter, his laughter just a little forced. She had brushed it off as holiday exhaustion. Now she watched his fingers hover over the edge of the paper. "Maybe she sent cookies again," she said lightly, trying to sound unbothered. "She likes doing that." He didn't laugh. "She would have brought those yesterday." He carried the package to the kitchen island and set it down as if it might shatter or explode. Somewhere down the hallway, the baby monitor crackled softly with the white noise of a child still asleep in a far room. Diane's door remained closed. "Open it," Samantha said, wrapping her arms around herself. He did. The paper yielded with a soft tear, revealing the plain envelope inside. No frills. His name again, no endearments. He slid a finger under the flap, the mundane movement feeling strangely ominous. The first thing he saw was the letter from the lawyer. His eyes scanned the letterhead, then the bolded subject line. There was a beat of silence, the kind that holds its breath. Samantha, watching his face, saw the color shift just slightly. "What is it?" she asked, trying and failing to keep the sharpness out of her voice. He didn't answer immediately. He read the first paragraph, then the second, his lips moving silently over the words. Notification of executed amendment, testamentary documents, change of primary beneficiary, effective immediately. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "Michael?" she pressed, now more insistent. "What does it say?" He swallowed, the sound loud in his own ears. It's from a lawyer. My mom's lawyer." Her spine straightened. "About what?" He laid the letter flat on the island, smoothing it unconsciously with his palm. "Her will." The word seemed to darken the room. Samantha blinked. "Is she okay? Did something happen?" He shook his head slowly. "No. It just says she's made changes." He didn't say the next part. He was no longer the person everything would go to when she died. That his name had been replaced by others, names he hadn't yet read, but knew must exist if he was absent. His fingers moved to the next document, a copy of the updated will. Legal language stacked neatly on crisp paper. He skimmed quickly, eyes jumping to the line where his own name should have been. The emptiness there hit him like a sudden drop in an elevator. There were beneficiaries, all right. The community clinic. A scholarship fund in a new name he didn't recognize. A neighbor listed with a modest bequest. A woman identified as friend and long-term companion in faith. Not him. Not her only child. His chest tightened with a feeling he didn't have a word for yet. Samantha leaned over his shoulder, reading. Her brow furrowed. She's giving it away? She flipped to the last page, where a signature sat in familiar ink. To strangers. He didn't answer. He moved to the final piece in the envelope. The letter in my hand, written on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. The one thing in the package that was entirely, undeniably me. He unfolded it carefully. My dearest Michael, by the time you read this, Christmas will have passed and the wrapping paper will be in the garbage. I'm writing not in anger, though I have been hurt, but in clarity. Sometimes when life holds up a mirror, you finally see the truth of what you've become to each other. He read that sentence twice. The mirror. The truth. Samantha watched his face harden and soften in turns, like clay being kneaded. You have built a beautiful life, my son. A big house. A good career. A loving wife. A child who will grow up never knowing what it is to go to bed hungry. I am proud of you for that. I always will be. But somewhere along the way, you began to treat where you came from as something to outgrow rather than honor. The piggy bank clinked in his memory. 3 bills folded without thinking. Are to your mother-in-law and a toy with $3 inside to me. I want you to understand, I do not envy Diane's car. I do not envy her life. I have never wanted her place at your table. What I do expect, Michael, is respect. I have measured my worth by your well-being for so many years that I forgot to check whether you were still measuring mine at all. He felt Samantha shift beside him, felt her inhale sharply at the mention of her mother. But the letter kept going. Love without boundaries shrinks the person giving it. I realized yesterday that I have been shrinking myself for you, making excuses for thoughtlessness, telling myself you were busy, that your world was different now. That ends today. My estate is small by your standards, perhaps. A house, some savings, a policy. I once sat in a lawyer's office and listed you as the person who would receive all of it when I am gone. Not because you needed it, but because I wanted my life's work to wrap around you one last time. Yesterday showed me that you already feel rich enough to treat my presence as disposable. So I have decided to give what I have to those who have seen me, not my usefulness. The clinic that fought to keep my job when I was too tired to fight for myself. The young woman across the street who reminds me of the girl I used to be. The friend who brings me soup when my joints hurt and sits with me when the evenings feel too long. You once promised you'd make sure I was never alone, never forgotten. I realize now you believe the promise expired once your own comfort was secure. This letter is not a punishment. It is a boundary. If you want to be in my life in a way that honors both of us, the door is open. But it will no longer be propped open by the hope that one day you will appreciate me because of what you stand to inherit. You have your Christmas lesson, Michael. a BMW in the driveway, a piggy bank on the side table, and a mother who has finally remembered her own value. If you want to talk, come as my son, not as a future heir. If you can't, then this will be the last gift I ever give you. The gift of consequences. With love that has learned to stand up straight. Mom. His hands trembled by the time he reached the signature. For a moment the kitchen went very, very quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to recede. Samantha looked from the pages in his hand to his face, searching for a cue on how to feel. It arrived in the form of Diane's voice, drifting sleepily down the hall. What on earth is all that noise this early? Some of us are still on holiday time. She entered the kitchen in a silk robe, hair wrapped, eyes narrowing as she saw the spread of papers on the island. What's this? Samantha answered before Michael could. It's from his mother, she said tightly. She changed her will. She's cutting him out. And she sent a whole speech about it. Diane's eyebrows shot up. Cutting you out? Over what exactly? Michael stared at the letter as if the ink might rearrange itself into something gentler. Over yesterday, he said slowly. Over the car. And the piggy bank. Diane scoffed, a humorless sound. You're kidding. She's punishing you because you did something nice for me. Samantha folded her arms, defensive lines carving into her posture. It's ridiculous, she added quickly. She's overreacting. It was a joke. Symbolic. Michael didn't speak. In the silence, something else stirred. An older voice, one that sounded suspiciously like his father's, the way he'd sounded before the heart attack stole his breath mid-sentence. You can tell who a man really is by how he treats people who have no power over him. His mother had repeated that line his whole life. He nodded, agreed, thought he understood. Now, standing in his gleaming kitchen with his name missing from a document that spelled out the future, he wasn't so sure. Diane picked up the will, scanning it with practiced eyes. She doesn't have that much, she said finally. This is more of a tantrum than a financial blow. The words hit him wrong. He flinched internally. She set the papers down with a little flick of her wrist, as if they offended her. Honestly, Michael, I know she's your mother, but this is manipulative. Emotional blackmail. You should call her and tell her she's being absurd. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the expectation there. The assumption that he would rally to her side, that his loyalty belonged to the world standing in this kitchen, not to the woman in the small house across town making tea for herself. Samantha nodded, eager agreement shining in her eyes. Mom's right. Don't let her guilt trip you. You've done so much for her. We've invited her into our home, bought her things. He remembered the piggy bank then, its cheap plastic body, the way my hands had held it like something fragile. He remembered not even knowing where the receipt was, because it had been an afterthought, a last-second grab near a cash register. The BMW had taken months of planning, test drives, finance arrangements, a conversation with their accountant. The piggy bank had taken 30 seconds and 3 bills he'd had in his wallet already. The contrast glared at him now. I need a minute, he said abruptly. He took the papers and stepped away from the island, from their voices, from the smell of Diane's perfume that suddenly felt cloying. In his office, he closed the door and leaned against it, the letter still in his hand. On the wall opposite his desk hung a framed certificate his mother had once insisted on paying for, his first degree, displayed in a wooden frame she'd saved up for in secret before surprising him. He remembered how proud she'd been, tears in her eyes, saying she wanted every visitor to see it when they came over. He had put it here in his own house because he said it fit the vibe. Now he saw that, in doing so, he'd taken a piece of her contribution and turned it into decor. He sat at his desk and read the letter again. The word that stuck to him this time was not consequences. It was boundary. He tried briefly to get angry. It would be easier. Anger was familiar armor. How dare she? Had a nice tidy rhythm to it. But every time he reached for outrage, memory interrupted him. His mother standing in the doorway of her old bedroom after his father's funeral, shoulders squared even though her eyes were swollen. His mother counting out change at the grocery store when his backpack needed replacing. His mother sitting in the stands of his school auditorium, hair slightly frizzy from the rain, clapping the loudest when he walked across any stage. $3. Piggy bank. He closed his eyes. In the kitchen, Diane and Samantha huddled together, voices low but sharp. I knew she'd pull something like this eventually, Diane was saying. She's always had that martyr energy. Samantha nodded. She's been off lately. Like she's judging everything we do. It's not our fault she didn't build wealth. We can't carry everyone. She should be grateful, Diane added. Really? With everything you've done. The car, the invitations, letting her be around the baby. Some people don't know how good they have it. The injustice of that statement would have made my younger self shake with anger. Now in my own kitchen, I sat quietly with my hands around my mug, not knowing the exact words being spoken but feeling the shape of them all the same. I could imagine their reactions. The indignation. The dismissal. The twisting of my decision into an attack. Only one person's reaction mattered. Around mid-morning my phone rang. Michael, the screen announced, his name still attached to a photo of him from years ago, hair longer, eyes softer, standing beside me at a picnic table. My finger hovered over the green button. I did not pick up. Not yet. The call went to voicemail. A minute later it rang again. Persistent. Imploring. The sound filled my little house, bouncing. I let it ring 3 times that morning. Each time I watched the screen, saw his name, felt the old instinct surge. Answer, soothe, smooth it over, make it easier for him. Each time I let it pass unanswered. My boundary had been written in ink. Now it needed to be held in behavior. Finally a text arrived. Mom, what is this? Can we talk? I stared at the words. No punctuation that sounded like anger, but no apology either. No recognition of why I might have done it. Just confusion, as if consequences were a foreign language. I typed a simple reply, my fingers steady. We can talk when you're ready to talk about respect, not money. The dots appeared, blinking, then disappearing. He was writing, erasing, writing again. Finally. This feels extreme. I exhaled slowly. There it was. His first verdict. In his office, he stared at her reply, frustration knotting his stomach. Extreme. Overkill. Dramatic. The easy words he could use if he wanted to protect himself from discomfort. But the letter lay open on his desk, and the word boundary kept jumping out at him, refusing to be ignored. He thought of how quick he'd been to spend thousands on Diane's car. Of the way he'd brushed off Samantha's suggestion to just get Mom something small and cute. Of the fact that he hadn't visited my home in months, citing busyness, while he'd flown to a bachelor party for a friend 3 states away without a second thought. He thought of the last time he'd asked me how I was really doing, and couldn't remember when it had been. Down the hall, Diane's voice cut through again. Michael, darling, we should call my attorney. This can be challenged. She's clearly not of sound mind if she's making spiteful decisions like this. He rubbed his temple. The idea of turning this into a legal battle made his skin crawl. The woman who'd once stayed up all night sewing a patch onto his favorite jacket, so he wouldn't be embarrassed at school, now being treated like an adversary in court? No, he said, louder than he meant to. Diane appeared in the office doorway, surprised. No? Sweetheart, you can't just let this stand. It's the principle of the thing. She's trying to guilt you. She's not, he said quietly. She's telling me how she feels. Diane frowned. By cutting you off? He met her gaze, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something in his eyes she didn't quite recognize, a distance that didn't have anything to do with her. She's not cutting me off from her, he said. She's cutting me off from expecting her to give without getting anything back. Samantha joined them, arms folded. So what? You're just going to accept this? Let her give everything to strangers. Something inside him snapped then, not into anger but into clarity. They're not strangers to her, he said sharply. They're the people who show up, who see her, who ask how she is when they don't need anything from her. The room fell quiet. He surprised himself with the next question. When's the last time we invited her somewhere that wasn't a holiday? He asked Samantha. A regular Sunday. A random Tuesday dinner. Anything. Samantha shifted uncomfortably. We're busy, Michael. We have a life. He nodded slowly. And somewhere along the way, she stopped being part of it. Silence spread like a spill. In my small house, time inched. I washed dishes that didn't need washing. Wiped counters that were already clean. My phone sat on the table, face down, a small rectangle of temptation. Part of me wanted him to show up at my door, breathless with apologies, ready to fall into my arms like the boy who once scraped his knee and needed me to tell him he was still loved. Another part of me, the part that had written the letter, knew it might not go that way. Consequences are not coins you put into a vending machine and get virtue back out. They are doors you close gently but firmly and wait to see who knocks. It was late afternoon. Not frantic. Not timid. Just 3 measured taps on wood that had known his knuckles since they were small. I opened the door. There he was, framed by the fading light. The same face I had kissed 1,000 times, now set in lines I didn't recognize. He held the envelope, crumpled at the edges like a piece of terrible news he had to deliver. For a moment neither of us spoke. We simply stood there, mother and son, separated by more than the threshold. "Can I come in?" he asked finally, voice rough. I studied him. The expensive coat, the polished shoes, the faint shadow of stubble he usually didn't let appear on work days. And beneath all that, the boy whose first instinct had always been to run to me when something hurt. "Are you here to argue about money?" I asked quietly. "Or to talk about respect?" His shoulders sagged, the breath leaving him in a visible rush. "Respect," he said. "I think." I stepped aside. As he entered, the familiar scent of my house wrapped around him, the mixture of old wood, laundry detergent, and something sweet lingering from the baking I'd done days before. He looked around as if seeing it for the first time, the worn armchair, the faded rug, the clock ticking softly on the wall. He sat at the kitchen table where I'd written the letter, right in the chair his father had once claimed as his own. I poured tea without asking if he wanted any. Old habits. Some comforts I was not yet ready to withdraw. The envelope lay between us like a third presence. "You surprised me," he said finally, tracing the edge of the paper. "Good," I replied. "Maybe surprises are what we needed." He winced at the word we. It implied shared responsibility. He knew deep down that this was mostly his. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said. The oldest, simplest defense. "Hurt doesn't always require intention," I replied. "The impact." He stared at his hands. "It was supposed to be funny. The piggy bank." Samantha said. I know what Samantha said. I cut in gently but firmly. "What do you say?" The room settled around us, holding its breath again. He swallowed. "It was thoughtless," he admitted. "Cheap. Lazy. I didn't think about what it would say to you." "What did the car say?" I asked. He looked up confused. "The BMW? Yes. What did that gift say to Diane?" He considered. "That I appreciate her. That I'm grateful for how she raised Samantha. That she's important to us." "And the piggy bank?" I asked. "What did that say to me?" He didn't try to wriggle out of it this time. "That you're an afterthought," he said quietly. "That I thought I could get away with the bare minimum because you'd never stop loving me." I let the truth settle between us, heavy but clean. "Do you know the difference between you and Diane?" I asked. "Besides our bank accounts?" He shook his head. "She raised her daughter with help," I said. "Houses, nannies, vacations, safety nets you've told me about more times than I can count. I raised you with a mop in one hand and your lunchbox in the other." His eyes shone, but he blinked the wetness away, the reflex to stay composed kicking in. "I don't begrudge her what she has," I continued. "But when you stood in that driveway and said she deserved that car more than anyone, you told the world exactly how you see us. Your gratitude flows uphill now. Toward wealth. Toward status." He flinched. "I guess I thought you didn't need," he trailed off, searching for the right word. "Recognition," I offered. "Kindness? Thought? You thought I had outgrown those." He shook his head, helpless. "I don't know. I just assumed you knew how I felt. Feelings hidden in your actions." He looked at the papers again. "And now this." "Yes," I said. "Now this." "Why didn't you talk to me instead?" he asked, frustration edging back in. "Why go straight to lawyers and wills?" I held his gaze. "Because talking hasn't worked for a long time, Michael. I've hinted. I've joked. I've said I miss you. I've told you I feel left out. You gave me apologies with the same effort you gave that piggy bank. Words you thought would be enough on their own." He couldn't deny it. Every memory he reached for confirmed it. "I needed you to understand that there are consequences to neglect," I said softly. Not just in bank accounts but in hearts. I don't want you to treat me better because you're hoping to inherit a house. I want you to treat me better because I'm your mother. He exhaled shakily. So is it final? He asked, nodding toward the will. For now, I replied. It reflects the reality of our relationship. Right now, more of my love and care flows to people who show up for me. My lawyer told me I can always change it again if my reality changes. The implication hung there, a quiet invitation. He ran a hand through his hair. Diane thinks you're being irrational, he said. I'm sure she does, I answered. She's not used to people saying no to her. He looked almost amused, despite everything. She said you're manipulating me. I smiled just a little. Did you feel manipulated when you read the letter? He thought about it honestly. No, he admitted. Confronted, maybe. Embarrassed. Guilty. But not manipulated. Good, I said. Then it did its job. What job is that? To hold up a mirror, I replied. So you can finally see the gap between the man you think you are and the man you're being to me. He stared at the table. We sat like that for a long time, the clock ticking steadily, the tea growing cold. Outside, my neighbor's car stopped once and then thought better of it. I don't want to lose you, he said at last, voice barely above a whisper. You haven't, I said. Not yet. I'm still here. My number still works. My door is open. But I won't spend whatever years I have left waiting on calls that don't come, or pretending piggy banks feel like love. He nodded slowly. I'll talk to Samantha, he said. And Diane. I'll tell them. This isn't their decision. It's mine. And I've been wrong. A small part of me relaxed. Not fully, but enough. You can't fix this with another gift, I warned gently. Not with flowers, not with a trip. This isn't a PR problem, Michael. It's a heart problem. I know, he said. I think I've been living like money could patch anything. He looked up at my modest kitchen, the worn tiles I'd never bothered to replace. But you don't want my money. No, I said. I want your presence. Your respect. Your time. Your honesty. The conversation continued, circling through memories and apologies, through small stories he'd forgotten, through a few I had held onto like talismans. He cried once, quickly, the tears wiped away with the edge of his sleeve, but I saw them anyway. I did not rush to soothe them. By the time he stood to leave, the light outside had shifted again, moving toward evening. He hugged me at the door a little too tightly, like he was afraid I might slip away. Are you going to tell Diane about the will? I asked. He nodded. Yes. And I'll tell her it's not up for debate. This is between you and me. I watched him walk to his car. The BMW had changed the landscape of their driveway. My little sedan, when it parked there on holidays, looked like an apology beside it. But today, as he drove away in his own everyday car, something felt different. Power was no longer parked only on their side of. Back in their house, when he told Samantha and Diane that he understood why I'd done what I'd done, that he was going to work on our relationship without making it about inheritance, the scream that escaped Samantha's throat was not just about money. It was about losing control of the narrative she'd been writing in her head. About realizing that the woman she'd dismissed as a sentimental, harmless nurse had just demonstrated more backbone than anyone in her circle of effortless friends. In that moment, my brown paper package completed its journey. It had started as paper and ink on my kitchen table. It ended as an earthquake in a house that had been built on the assumption that I would always accept whatever scraps of attention I was given. The conflict was no longer about a BMW or a piggy bank. It was about the uncomfortable truth that you cannot buy absolution with grand gestures while starving the people who love you of everyday kindness. And as night fell over the city, two houses sat under the same sky. One, large and gleaming, suddenly echoing with raised voices and arguments about wills and priorities. The other, small and worn, quiet but steady, inhabited by a woman who had finally chosen herself without waiting for permission. The war for my own dignity had begun. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I was losing. The house across town simmered long after Michael drove away from mine. Arguments tend to echo longer in expensive spaces, bouncing off high ceilings and glass surfaces, making anger sound larger than it truly is. Diane paced the living room in her satin slippers, each step a small performance of outrage. Samantha sat stiffly on the couch, arms folded so tightly she looked wrapped in her own indignation. They were united in one thing, disbelief that someone like me had the audacity to change the rules. To them, my decision wasn't a boundary. It was a betrayal. To me, it was the first breath of oxygen after years of holding still in stale air. While their voices rose in accusations, my home remained quiet. My home remained quiet. The afternoon light trickled through my curtains in soft patches. I brewed a new pot of tea, not out of nerves but out of habit. The kettle hissed, the floor creaked, and for the first time in many holidays, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anyone. Waiting for validation. Waiting for apology. Waiting for my son to remember who he'd been. That was the shift I hadn't expected. Taking back your dignity doesn't just change how others see you. Changes how you see yourself. Across town, a very different awakening was happening. Diane was furious in a way wealthy people often are. Convinced that fairness was measured in dollars and decorum, not heart. Her voice cut through the air. She's manipulating you, Michael. Mothers do this sort of thing. They guilt their children. You can't fall for it. Michael rubbed his forehead. He looked exhausted inside and out. It's not manipulation, Diane. It's a consequence. For what? Diane barked. Giving me a car? For forgetting her, he said simply. That silenced her. Not because she understood, but because she didn't like the answer. Samantha leaned forward, voice thin and sharp. So what now? You're going to crawl back to her? Beg for your spot in the will. He shot her a look he'd never given her before. Disbelief, disappointment, and something dangerously close to realization. I'm not thinking about her will, he said. I'm thinking about how I've treated her. Samantha scoffed, but the sound trembled. You're not seriously taking her side. I'm taking responsibility, he replied. It was a small sentence, but in that family it was seismic. Diane crossed her arms. Well, I think this whole situation is a disaster. She acted impulsively. You need to convince her to reverse it. End of story. Michael shook his head. This isn't about money. To the language she respected, the one she trusted. She couldn't fathom a world where love was the currency and she wasn't wealthy in it. I didn't know the details of their conversation, but as the hours passed, I felt the ripple of it in the quiet of my home. Some changes in your life arrive loudly. Others travel on invisible currents. My boundary had started something. A shift. Crack. A truth rising to the surface. By evening, Michael texted again. Mom, can I see you tomorrow? Just us. No distractions. I want to talk more. Simple. Straightforward. Not coded in apologies yet, but real. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Mothers learn to distinguish between gestures meant to appease and gestures meant to repair. This one felt like the latter. But trust, once shaken, doesn't fall back into place like puzzle pieces waiting to be clicked. It rebuilds slowly layer by layer. Tomorrow is fine, I replied. But no rushing. We'll talk when we talk. He typed back immediately. Thank you. Across the quiet of my kitchen, the clock ticked on, unbothered by the weight of the day. But in their home, the unraveling continued. Diane launched into a tirade about entitlement, calling my actions inappropriate, ungrateful, and dramatic. She listed everything she believed she'd done for Michael, advice, support, connections, and insisted that my decision was an insult to the whole family. Samantha cried, but not out of empathy. Her tears were the kind that came from losing control of a narrative she'd curated carefully. The perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect household, the perfect hierarchy. And at the top of that hierarchy, she had always assumed she stood just above me. But that's the thing about hierarchies built on disrespect. They crumble the moment the person at the bottom stops kneeling. Michael didn't yell back. He just went quiet, the kind of quiet men fall into when they're replaying every small moment they should have tended to and didn't. He sat on the couch staring at his hands, replaying the sight of the piggy bank, asking himself questions he hadn't asked in years. Questions like, when did I stop showing up for her? When did I start giving the best of myself to everyone except the one person who made me who I am? How did I not see what she needed from me? And most painfully, when did I become the man she needed to protect herself from? These realizations weren't dramatic. They didn't explode. They settled quietly like dust on a forgotten shelf. But once dust settles, you can see everything more clearly. Later that night, he stepped outside onto the porch. The air was colder than usual, and for a moment he just stood there, looking down the street as if expecting me to appear like I did when he was little and needed picking up from a friend's house. But I wasn't coming this time. He knew that now. Inside, Diane muttered loudly about people who don't know their place. Samantha complained about the will. But he didn't respond. He felt that their voices were part of the problem, not the solution. For the first time in years, he stood up to both of them. "I need space," he said finally, voice calm but unmovable. "Please stop talking about her like she's nothing. She raised me." Diane froze. Samantha's mouth fell open. Michael walked upstairs without another word. And that's how the night ended, 3 people in a big house, suddenly realizing the foundation wasn't as solid as they believed. Back in my home, I sat in my living room with my hands resting softly around a warm mug. My house was small. My life was simple. But that night, for the first time in a long while, I felt steady. I hadn't lost a son. I had finally given him the chance to find his way back. Boundaries don't break relationships. They show you which ones were real to begin with. Tomorrow, he would arrive at my door again, not as a man checking a box on his holiday obligations list, but stepping into the truth he'd forgotten, carrying the weight of a lesson he now understood fully. And Act 4 closed on that scene. 2 homes illuminated by winter light. One echoing with arguments about money, the other washed gently in peace with a mother ready, not to forgive instantly, not to collapse into old patterns, but to speak truth softly, with dignity finally returned to her own hands. Morning arrived slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated before climbing into a day that held more truth than comfort. I woke earlier than usual, not from restlessness, but from a quiet resolve that had settled in me overnight. Boundaries, once spoken, have a way of straightening the spine. My house felt different because I felt different. I made breakfast the way I always did on Saturdays: oatmeal, a sliced apple, a touch of cinnamon, simple rituals that kept me tethered to myself. And while the kettle boiled, I looked around my little kitchen and realized something. For the first time in decades, I wasn't bracing myself for his arrival. I wasn't rehearsing my emotions or pre-forgiving whatever oversight he might bring. I was ready, not hopeful. Present, not waiting. Steady, not shrinking. Across the city, his home was not nearly as peaceful. Michael had slept poorly. His dreams had been tangled threads. My handwriting, the cheap piggy bank, Diane's sharp voice, the quiet weight of my letter. He woke with a heaviness sitting squarely in his chest, as if regret had taken physical form. He showered silently, dressed deliberately, and ignored the sound of Samantha's phone buzzing, her group chat already alive with commentary about dramatic mothers and overblown wills. He didn't tell her he was leaving. He didn't tell Diane either. He simply picked up his keys, exhaled once, and walked out the door. Some turning points are loud, but most are quiet. This one was the quiet kind. The kind where a man realizes he is no longer willing to be influenced by noise disguised as guidance. He drove with both hands on the wheel, the city passing in soft, unfocused shapes outside the window. He didn't play music. Didn't call ahead. The closer he got to my street, the more his heartbeat picked up. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. He had driven this route hundreds of times in childhood, back when his entire world fit inside my company and the shape of my voice. When he pulled into my driveway, he saw my car sitting in its usual spot, aging, dented on one side, dependable as the sunrise. He remembered helping his father wash it in the summer, remembered complaining about the heat until I bribed him with lemonade. He remembered things he had buried under the noise of adulthood. He knocked gently. I opened the door. This time I didn't ask what he wanted. This time he didn't come with excuses. He stepped inside with the posture of someone who finally understood that apologies require more than words. They require humility. We sat in the living room. I in my usual armchair. He on the couch that dipped slightly in the middle. The house was filled with quiet, the comforting kind, not the strained silence that hides unsaid truths. He rested his elbows on his knees, fingers interlaced. "Mom," he said softly, "I thought about everything you said yesterday." I nodded for him to continue. "I've been unfair. Blind, really. I didn't realize how much of my life was being shaped by people who see value only in money. People who don't know me the way you do." He paused, searching for the right words. "I think I've been performing." trying to prove I belong in that world. And in the process, I forgot who I was. For the first time in years, he sounded like the boy I had raised. I always thought you didn't need anything from me, he continued. Because you're strong. Because you handled everything when Dad died. Because you never complained. His voice cracked slightly. But strength doesn't mean you don't deserve fairness. My throat tightened. But I stayed steady. Michael, I said, all I ever wanted was to be seen. Not worshipped, not praised. Just acknowledged. Included. He looked down at his hands. I thought giving Diane that car would make her proud of me. Make her see me as good enough for her daughter. But I didn't think how it looked to you. What it said. It said you forgot the roots that held you when nothing else did, I replied. It said you were giving gratitude to the newest chapter instead of the first one. He nodded, guilt written plainly across his face. I did forget. A long pause passed between us, long enough for the truth to settle in fully. Then he said the words I didn't expect, but had needed. I want to make it right. Not just today. Not with a gift. But with how I show up. I didn't soften instantly. Mothers do not rebuild trust in a single sunrise. What does that look like to you? I asked. He inhaled deeply. It looks like staying connected. Calling you without being reminded. Bringing the baby over because you deserve to be in her life. Asking how you are and actually listening. Making room for you not just on holidays, but in the everyday. I watched him closely. And the will. His expression shifted. Shame, worry, resolve all moving through him like weather. It hurt. I won't lie. But it made sense. Because I haven't earned the place I assumed would always be mine. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out a small envelope he didn't recognize. I placed it in front of him. What's this? He asked. A copy of the will before I changed it. He froze. You kept it? Yes, I said. Because boundaries aren't meant to punish. They're meant to teach. I kept it so I could decide based on your actions, not your apologies, whether it should stay or return. His eyes glistened, deep, quiet ones of realization. Mom, I want to earn my way back. I nodded slowly. Time will tell. He nodded too, accepting the truth instead of resisting it. We talked for another hour. About memories. About his father. About the parts of him that money had pulled away from and the parts that still remained inside him, waiting to be seen again. He apologized, not with empty assurances but with specifics. He owned the thoughtlessness, the distance, the way he'd let other voices drown out his own. Then came the moment I knew the turning point was real. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. The piggy bank. Not shiny, not symbolic, not cute. He held it gently like something fragile. I kept it, he said softly, to remind me of what I almost lost yesterday. My chest tightened, but not from pain this time. He set it on the table between us, the way he used to place rocks he'd found at the playground when he wanted me to admire them. I want to earn your trust again, he said. Not because of money. Because you deserve a son who remembers where his heart came from. A quiet washed over us, the kind that marks a shift, a threshold, a moment you know you'll remember with clarity even 20 years from now. Outside, a car drove by, children laughed down the street, life kept moving. But inside my house, something settled back into place. Not fully healed, not perfectly repaired, but begun. He stood to leave, and before he walked out, he did something he hadn't done in years. He hugged me first. Tightly. With intent. With meaning. With every apology folded silently into the pressure of his arms. As his car pulled away, I watched from the doorway, not gripping the frame for support, not swallowing disappointment, not wishing things had gone differently. I simply watched with steadiness. Because Act 5 ended not with forgiveness, a mother's dignity restored, a son's humility awakened, a family's fracture shifting slowly toward something that might one day be called healing. And the turning point, the real turning point, wasn't the letter or the will or the scream in the big house. It was this. For the first time in years, he left because he wanted to come back. There is a particular quiet that comes after truth has been spoken, the kind that doesn't echo with regret, but settles like dust in a sunbeam, revealing everything with gentle clarity. That was the quiet that filled my home the day after Michael left. Not hopeful, not triumphant, just honest. I found myself moving slower that morning, not because of age or weariness, but because moments of real change have a way of making you stand still long enough to notice them. I brewed tea and watched the light spill across the kitchen table, landing softly on the piggy bank he'd returned to me. It sat there like a tiny witness to everything unsaid between us, its childish smile holding a story it wasn't designed to carry. I touched it gently, as if acknowledging not the object itself, but the shift it represented. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. It was possibility, quiet, fragile, unassuming. Reflection has a strange way of folding time. While I moved around my home tidying corners and watering plants, memories drifted in like visitors. Ones I hadn't summoned but welcomed anyway. I remembered the first time Michael had stormed into the house after his father died, angry at a world that had taken the man who taught him how to throw a baseball. I remembered sitting beside him on the couch, holding his hand, letting him cry into my shoulder even though my own grief sat in my throat like a stone. He hadn't cried like that in years. Yesterday the tears had been small, controlled, adult, yet same at their core. Tears of recognition. Tears of remembering who he once was. On the other side of the city, the reflection taking place was not quiet. In the large house where wealth lived louder than truth, tension clung to the air like humidity. Diane hovered in the kitchen, pacing in short, irritated strides. She was unused to scenarios she couldn't orchestrate. Her brow furrowed, her lips pressed together in a thin, dissatisfied line. Samantha sat at the island, scrolling on her phone, but her fingers moved without purpose. She wasn't reading. She was stewing. Her reflection was different from mine. Less about truth, more about inconvenience. To her, the problem wasn't the hurt I had carried or the clarity I had gained. To her, the problem was that she no longer had narrative control. She replayed the moment Michael defended me. The disbelief. The sting. The realization that, for once, she wasn't the emotional center of his attention. In a home where Diane's voice always won and Samantha's expectations always carried weight, my decision, my boundary, had done something neither of them expected. It revealed their influence had limits. Reflection unsettles those who rely on control. Diane crossed the room abruptly, breaking the uneasy silence. She manipulated him, she said confidently, as if repetition could turn opinion into fact. Samantha didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Diane filled silence with monologues. "This is outrageous," Diane went on. "She's acting like some vindictive matriarch." And he fell for it. Absolutely fell for it. Samantha finally lowered her phone. "He didn't fall for anything," she murmured. "He saw something in her letter that we didn't." Diane scoffed. "Oh, please." A grown man getting guilt by a retired nurse with a fragile ego. Samantha interrupted gently but firmly. "She raised him." She paused. "We didn't." The words hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't admiration, Samantha wasn't there yet. But it was an acknowledgement she had that unsettled her almost as much as it unsettled Diane. Because somewhere beneath her resentment, beneath her irritation and pride, another feeling flickered in her chest, one she preferred to keep buried. Insecurity. Reflection, when it finally finds the cracks in you, doesn't always speak kindly. While their house buzzed with agitation, mine filled with small tasks and gentle truths. I dusted the shelves, straightened the books, folded laundry with the slow care of someone tending to her own peace. When I opened the curtains in the living room, sunlight poured in, illuminating the framed photographs on the wall. Most were years old, faded at the edges. Michael in a graduation gown. Michael in a Halloween costume. Michael holding the trophy from his 5th grade spelling bee. My husband smiling beside me at a community festival long before the heart attack took him too soon. I paused in front of the wedding photo of Michael and Samantha. I had been smiling in the picture, genuinely smiling because that day, even with all its awkwardness and subtle exclusions, I believed their union would bring more love into my life, not less. Now I traced the frame with my fingertips and whispered something I hadn't said out loud before. It's not too late to get it right. Reflection softens you, even when you don't intend it to. Later that afternoon, my neighbor Rosa knocked on the door carrying a small container of soup. Her joints were stiff from the cold, so I ushered her in quickly and set the kettle to boil. We sat at the table, Two older women surrounded by the quiet hum of life slowing down, sharing stories the way we always did. I didn't tell her everything about the will or the drama. Some truths are too raw to expose without care, but she knew enough from the look in my eyes. "You look lighter," she said, smiling into her cup. "Do I?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Like someone finally turned off the pressure in your chest." I nodded. "I think I finally stood up straight." She squeezed my hand. "And did it hurt?" "Yes," I admitted. "But it hurt less than shrinking." She laughed softly. "Growth always comes with soreness." Meanwhile, in that large house, growth looked very different. Michael returned home hours later, calmer but quieter. When he walked through the door, he didn't seek approval, something Samantha noticed instantly. His posture wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic. It wasn't even conflicted. It was resolved. And that resolution unsettled her deeply. He sat at the dinner table, ate slowly, answered questions with careful brevity. He wasn't cold. Just somewhere else inside himself. Somewhere they couldn't reach. And that was what terrified them. Because reflection, when done honestly, begins to change your loyalties. After dinner, he picked up his daughter, cradled her gently, kissed her cheek. His eyes softened, the same softness I'd seen when he hugged me earlier. He whispered something to the baby that no one else heard. The little one touched his chin with her tiny hand, as if anchoring him. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a truth he couldn't yet voice. He wanted his daughter to know her grandmother. Not the version filtered through Samantha's frustration or Diane's judgments. The real one. The woman who had held him through storms he barely remembered. Reflection doesn't just change how you see the past. It changes how you imagine the future. Later that night, when the house had gone still, Michael sat in the guest room, the one they pretended was an office but mostly used for storage. He took out his phone and typed a text he deleted 3 times before getting it right. "Mom, would it be okay if I came by next weekend? I want you to see the baby. I want her to know you." When he hit send, something in him unclenched. Across the city, my phone buzzed. I looked at the message and a small warm ache settled in my chest. Not joy. Not forgiveness. Hope. The healthy kind, not the blind hope that begs. The quiet hope that grows only after truth has been spoken. My response was simple. "Yes, we'll take it slow. But yes." I set the phone down and felt something shift inside me. That night, as the streetlights flickered on outside my window, I sat with my thoughts. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with understanding. He was trying. She was resisting. Diane was unraveling. And I was healing. Reflection had done its job. The days following Michael's visit unfolded with a gentleness I hadn't felt in years. Not rush, not desperation, just small, steady steps carrying us toward something that resembled healing. The air in my home seemed lighter, as if the walls themselves recognized that the storm had passed its loudest point. What remained was the soft work of rebuilding. I spent the next morning sweeping the porch, a habit I'd kept from the old neighborhood. The bristles brushed against the wood in slow, familiar strokes, and with each sweep, I felt the remnants of past disappointments drifting away like dust. Somewhere inside, the piggy bank rested on the table, no longer a symbol of insult, but a reminder of a lesson learned by both of us. Across town, the atmosphere was very different. Michael moved through his own home like a man seeing clearly for the first time after years of blurred vision. He noticed things that had always been there but never quite reached him, the sharp edges of Diane's opinions, the way Samantha's annoyance flared whenever something wasn't about her, the small jabs disguised as jokes that came too easily. He wasn't angry at them. He simply wasn't absorbing it anymore. When he held his daughter that afternoon, her soft weight against his chest, something inside him tightened with quiet urgency. He didn't want her to grow up in a house where worth was measured by price tags, or where affection was rationed based on convenience. He wanted her to know abundance, the kind that didn't need wealth to exist. And he knew exactly where she could learn that. He texted me again 3 days after our conversation. This time longer. "Mom, I want to bring the baby this weekend. Just us. No pressure. I think she needs to know you. And I think I need that too." My fingertips hovered over the screen for a moment before I typed back. "Let's do it. I'll make something warm." His reply came instantly. "I'll be there." Saturday arrived crisp and cold. The kind of morning where breath hangs in the air like unspoken thoughts. I brewed a fresh pot of soup and wiped down the kitchen counters twice. Not out of nerves but out of habit. Something inside me wanted the space to feel welcoming, even though it always had been. When Michael's car pulled into the driveway, the baby seat visible in the back, something softened inside me. He stepped out with her in his arms, bundled in a pink hat and wrapped in the thick blanket I'd given them before things grew distant. He walked up with a shy smile, the same one he had as a child when he'd done something right but wasn't sure if it would be noticed. "Hey, Mom. Come in," I said, opening the door wide. He stepped inside, and the warmth of the house wrapped around him instantly. The baby blinked at the sudden change in temperature. I held out my arms not with entitlement, but with quiet hope. "May I?" I asked. He hesitated only for a second, habit not resistance, then placed her gently in my arms. And there she was. Tiny fingers. Soft cheeks. The faintest scent of baby lotion lingering in the folds of her clothes. She stared up at me, curious but calm, as if sensing in some old, instinctive way that she was safe. I traced her cheek with the back of my finger, the way I had once done with her father decades earlier, in a different kitchen with different walls. Time collapsed softly like a page being turned. Michael watched us, his eyes shining with something heavier than gratitude, but gentler than guilt. Recognition, perhaps. Or rediscovery. We sat together in the living room, the baby resting peacefully in my arms. The silence between us wasn't strained, it was full. He spoke first. "I should have brought her sooner." I shook my head. "You're here now. That's enough for today." He nodded, letting out a breath as though my words loosened something he'd been holding too tightly. I could see him observing the room, noticing details he hadn't noticed in years. A new frame on the wall, the software on the armchair, the way I'd arranged the blankets over the couch. "You always keep everything so calm," he said. "Chaos doesn't last long in a home where the heart has learned to be steady," I replied. He smiled almost shyly. "I want her to have some of that." We talked for a while about the baby's sleep schedule, about his workload, about the small details of life that make relationships feel lived in again. He didn't mention Diane or Samantha, and I didn't ask. Healing never needs every piece of the story at once. It needs honesty, not speed. At one point, he asked if he could make us both a cup of tea. I watched him move through my kitchen with the awkward familiarity of someone who hadn't used it in far too long. He opened the wrong cabinet first, then the right one. He held the kettle up to the light as if wondering when it had become slightly more dented. He took out 2 cups, one chipped, one older, and placed them carefully on the table. It was simple. But simple things sometimes carry the weight of mountains. While he poured the tea, the baby stirred in my arms, and I hummed a tune I hadn't sung in years, a lullaby his father used to love. She calmed instantly. Michael froze mid-motion, his eyes softening at the sound. "I haven't heard that since." He stopped. He didn't need to finish. I nodded. "He'd be proud of you for coming back." He swallowed hard. "I hope so." "You're trying," I said. "Trying is the doorway to becoming." He sat beside me, elbows on his knees. "What about?" he asked quietly. "Not to pressure you. I just want to know where we stand." I looked at him, really looked, and answered truthfully. "We stand where we are right now, in a place where effort matters more than inheritance." He nodded. "I'm okay with that." That was the turning moment. The one I'd been waiting for without even knowing it. He wasn't trying to reclaim something material. He was trying to reclaim us. As the afternoon drifted into evening, he helped me wash dishes while the baby slept softly on the couch. He talked about memories he hadn't mentioned in years, his favorite childhood teacher, the first time he realized his father wasn't invincible, the night he snuck home late as a teenager and thought I didn't notice. "I noticed," I said. We both laughed quietly. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door, looking down at the baby, then at me. "Thank you," he said softly. "For today." "You're welcome," I replied. "Come back when you're ready. Not when you feel obligated." "I will," he promised. And this time I believed him. When the door closed behind them, my house felt full. Not with noise, but with a returning presence, a warmth that had been missing for too long. It wasn't reconciliation. Not fully. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something real. Slow. Steady. Quiet. Like the way healing returns to a wound that has finally stopped being reopened. And as night settled over my little street, I realized something. The story wasn't bending back toward the past. It was bending toward a future built on truth, one where dignity stayed intact, where love moved slowly but honestly, and where a son learned at last that the first woman to hold him still had a place he needed to return to. Not because of a will, not because of guilt, but because he finally remembered the truth of who he was, and who I had always been. The beginning of resolution had finally been unfamiliar, yet deeply welcome. Not rushed, not tense, just steady, the way healing often arrives when no one is looking directly at it. My home carried the faint scent of baby lotion long after Michael and my granddaughter left that first afternoon. A softness lingered in the air, the kind that makes even old floorboards feel warm beneath your feet. I didn't expect him to return immediately. Not because I doubted him, but because real change isn't measured by a single moment of clarity. It is measured by the consistency that follows it. Yet 3 days later, as I watched the evening settle outside my living room window, his car pulled into my driveway again. This time there was no hesitation in his knock, no uncertainty in his eyes when I opened the door. He carried himself differently, less hurried, less weighed down. He had the look of a man choosing where to place his heart instead of drifting where he was pushed. "I brought her again," he said softly, lifting the baby slightly. "She slept on the way." "Come in," I replied with a smile that wasn't forced, wasn't cautious. It was simply true. He stepped inside, and this time he didn't scan the room out of curiosity or distance. He moved with easy familiarity, like someone remembering the layout of a home they once walked through without thinking. I took the baby, and she nestled into my arms with a small sigh, her tiny fingers curling around the fabric of my sweater. Michael watched her, then me, and something flickered in his eyes, a quiet longing for simplicity, for grounding, for a life tied to something deeper than status or expectation. We sat again in the living room, and the silence that filled the space was comfortable enough to rest in. "I talked to them," he said finally. He didn't need to specify who them was. Their presence always lingered in the edges of his choices. "What came of it?" I asked. "A mess," he said honestly. "No defensiveness, no softening. They don't understand. They don't want to understand." I nodded slowly. "Understanding isn't required for you to change. Only willingness is." He leaned back, exhaling. "They said you're influencing me, that you're punishing me. And what do you think?" I asked calmly, not out of insecurity but clarity. He looked down at his hands. "I think it's the first time anyone's told me the truth without trying to shape it to make me feel comfortable." He paused, and it hurt because it was real. I reached out and touched his forearm gently, a gesture I hadn't done in years. Sometimes truth arrives wearing clothes that make us uncomfortable, but if we let it sit long enough, we realize we've needed it more than comfort. He nodded, swallowing. "I see that now." We talked, not about the will, not about inheritance. Those topics had faded from his mind as quickly as they had overtaken it, but about his childhood, his father, the weight he carried and didn't recognize until it became too heavy to bear. He told me how he had begun noticing the small cruelties that had woven themselves into his home, the dismissive comments, the emotional transactions, the hierarchy subtle but sharp. "It's like I woke up," he said, "and I can't unsee it." "That's truth," I replied. "Once it enters, it doesn't leave. It just unfolds." Later, when the baby fell asleep again, he walked her gently around the living room, looking at the photographs on the walls with fresh eyes. He traced the edges of the frames lightly, stopping in front of one where he stood at 6 years old, missing a front tooth and grinning widely as I held him close. "She should know this version of me too," he whispered. "She will," I said, "if you let her." In that moment, something inside him settled, something that had been restless for years. He placed the baby back in my arms and sat on the couch as if anchoring himself to something that felt more like truth than anything he'd been living. "I want to tell you something," he said quietly. "Go on." "I didn't just come today to visit." His voice wavered for a moment before steadying. "I came to tell you, I'm changing things. With them. With the house. With how things are run." I watched him closely. "What does that mean, Michael?" "It means I'm not letting other people speak for me anymore. I'm not letting them decide my relationships, my priorities, my family." "Good," I said. "Your life should be spoken in your own voice." He nodded. They're angry. Diane is furious. Samantha, she's confused. But I can't keep living in that noise. And you shouldn't, I said gently. Noise grows when people depend on it to hide their own emptiness. A long silence settled. Not heavy, reflective. Mom, he said softly, I want you to know something. When I left your house the other day, I felt lighter. Not guilty. Not ashamed. Just clear. Clarity is the beginning of redemption. I want to come back into your life the right way, he continued. Not because of what I used to expect. Not because of holidays or obligations. But because I miss being your son. The real version of it. I held his gaze. Then come as that version. I will. As evening dimmed into early night, he helped me feed the baby, helped me tidy the kitchen, helped me bring down a bag of trash I hadn't realized was heavy. He didn't do these things out of duty, but out of a desire to belong in the space again. When it was time to leave, he lingered at the doorway. The air was cool, the sky darkening into winter's early night. Thank you, he said softly, for not giving up on me. I did give up, I replied gently. Just not on you, on waiting for you to notice my worth without me having to remind you. He lowered his head, understanding the distinction completely. And now, he asked. Now, I said, you're choosing to notice, longer this time. Truthfully. With nothing between us except honesty. When he got into his car, I stood at the doorway watching him pull away, not out of longing but out of gratitude. He was changing, slowly and perfectly but sincerely. And in the large house he returned to, something had shifted. He entered with a quiet resolve, the kind that makes proud people nervous. Samantha was waiting, arms crossed, questions ready. Diane was on the phone in the next room, her voice sharp with indignation. But he didn't waver. He held the baby close and walked past their noise, their questions, their entitled expectations, not ignoring them but no longer owned by them. He set his daughter in her crib and kissed her forehead. For the first time he realized that her future depended on the truth he was choosing now, not the comfort he had clung to before. And as he stood in the doorway watching her sleep, he whispered something no one else heard. She will know her grandmother. In my little house I turned off the lights, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. The beginning of redemption, not in him alone but in the space between us. A soft place where healing grows. A quiet corner of truth reclaimed. And for the first time in a very long while, both mother and son stepped into a version of themselves that carried more honesty, more dignity, and more love than the lives they had been living. Winter deepened slowly, the way seasons do when life itself is shifting. Neighborhoods quieted earlier in the evenings, the sun slipping away before most families had even finished dinner. But inside my little home warmth lingered, soft lamps, simmering pots, and the gentle presence of memories that no longer hurt to hold. And now something else lingered too. A steady rhythm of footsteps up my driveway. A soft knock each week. The small cry of a baby who was quickly learning my voice. Michael came often, not with grand gestures, not bearing gifts meant to erase the past, but with the kind of presence that blooms only when a heart is truly rebuilding. Sometimes he stayed for hours, sometimes only long enough to drop off a warm smile and a sleeping granddaughter. But every visit stretched a small bridge further across a gap we once thought might never close. The first time he brought her in the snow, bundled and rosy-cheeked, he looked around my house with a familiarity that had returned as naturally as breath. I want her to grow up knowing this place, he said softly. Knowing you. I nodded, feeling gratitude settle into me, not the kind that explodes loudly, but the quiet kind that wraps itself around bones and makes a person stand a little taller. Across town, his home was changing too, though not with the ease ours had. Samantha's voice was sharper now, her patience thinner. Diane hovered more often, pressing opinions into spaces where they didn't belong. Their world had been built on a certainty that nothing would ever shift beneath them, and now, without warning, the ground had begun to tremble. One evening, after a particularly tense day, Michael sat alone in his car outside their house, engine off, headlights dimmed. He didn't cry. He didn't fall apart. He simply sat with the truth he had been avoiding for years. He had given too much power to people who didn't know how to value it. He had let others dictate what family meant, what love meant, what respect should look like. But those days were done. He stepped out of the car and carried his daughter inside with a clarity that didn't ask for permission. The next morning he told Samantha, calmly, respectfully, with dignity, that things needed to change. Not endings, not threats, just boundaries he should have set long ago. She didn't understand at first. She resisted. She pushed. But he stayed grounded, the way a tree grows deeper roots in the winter and waits for the thaw. Truth doesn't need to fight. It just needs to stand. And it was standing now, firm, unshakable, no longer afraid of the noise around it. Meanwhile, my home filled with moments I'd never expected to have again. The baby learning to reach for me. Michael lifting her high and laughing the same laugh he once had as a child. Simple dinners where nothing dramatic happened, just conversations that flowed gently across the hours. Sundays where we took slow walks, the stroller wheels cutting tracks in soft patches of snow. Each moment stitched us back together, not perfectly but beautifully. One afternoon in early spring, as the thaw finally reached our little street, Michael arrived with a small cardboard box. Not fancy, not polished, not dramatic. I found this in the garage, he said, placing it on my kitchen table. I thought, maybe you'd want to see it. Inside were objects I hadn't seen in years. The first Mother's Day card he ever made me, crayon flowers, uneven handwriting. A photo of him and his father fishing at a lake hours from here. A keychain he'd bought me at a school fair, chipped at the edges but still holding the shape of a heart. A drawing of our old house, stick figures smiling from every window. He sat across from me, watching my reaction not with fear, but with reverence. These are yours, he said. I don't know why I took them with me. Maybe because I thought I'd bring them back someday. You just didn't realize what someday meant, I replied gently. He nodded, smiling faintly. I do now. And then, without ceremony, without apology, he took my hand the way he used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. Mom, I'm here, he said. Really here. It wasn't a promise. It was a truth already in motion. As weeks passed, Diane's anger softened into confusion. Samantha's resistance slowly quieted. Not because they suddenly agreed, but because they finally understood something crucial. Michael was no longer choosing between two worlds. He was choosing the truth in his own, and that truth had begun with a simple boundary written in ink, one that taught both of us the value of standing tall. By late spring, the garden outside my home bloomed again. Lilies, wildflowers, tiny green shoots that pushed through soil with the quiet conviction of things determined to grow. One afternoon, as the baby took her first wobbly steps across my living room rug, I felt a warmth rise in my chest that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Peace. Not fragile peace. Not borrowed peace. Not peace that needed permission. The kind of peace that comes when a mother finally sees the truth she always hoped her child would grow into. And as the little one stumbled into my arms, Michael laughed from the couch, a laugh I had waited years to hear again. And the room filled with something more powerful than redemption or victory. It filled with wholeness. The kind that comes after long winters. The kind that comes when wounds don't just close, they heal. The kind that stays. This is my son gave his mother-in-law a BMW while I got $3. So I walked away. But endings aren't always where the pain stops, they're where the truth begins. In the quiet after the storm, a mother learned her worth. A son remembered his roots, and a family found its way back, not through gifts, not through inheritance, but through the slow, steady work of choosing each other again. And sometimes, brother, that choice is the most valuable thing a heart can ever give.